Hey there, Agile Macaws, and welcome to another episode of Agile Bytes, the podcast sponsored by Integrity Inspired Solutions, where we build software in an agile manner day in and day out. We've been talking to managers of agile teams about how to go about that successfully, and this episode is not going to be different. But now, whereas before we were kind of talking in broad categories, things that you want to get done first, things to kind of lay the foundation, now we're going to start drilling into some specific things that you're going to want to get done probably sooner rather than later. Today, we're going to talk about visualization. And I don't mean the kind of visualization where, you imagine yourself with some whiskey and a cigar because now you're the CEO of your company. If that helps you, by all means, shine on, you crazy diamond. But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about creating visualizations of things that would normally be invisible to you and invisible to other people so that you can start seeing what's going on and making decisions about what to do about it. So the visualization that I'm going to recommend that you pursue pretty early on is, how does something get from a request to a delivery? Now, in your particular case, if you're managing agile software teams, those requests could be for software packages, it could be for individual features or whatever. But how do you get from somebody asking your group to do something, your department, your team, whatever, to that team, department, whatever, delivering the finished product? And when you are mapping this out, don't skimp on the details, at least at first. You really want to get your arms around every increment of that process. Now, you're not going to hold on to all of that information necessarily, but in the beginning, you're going to want that. There was a client in town a long time ago, and they brought me in for a meeting. I thought it was just to talk about Integrity's services, but what happened was I found myself in front of the board, and they put a diagram up on the screen in the conference room. That was their process, all the way from request to delivery, and the different committees involved, and the different servers, and the different deployments, the different checks, the different checks for Sarbanes-Oxley compliance, and all that stuff. And it was very, very long, very, very visual though. And they said, okay, so Phil, how would you optimize this? And then like 20 heads turned down the table to watch me. So it was kind of a weird moment, but I will say that one thing that they did very well was create the visualization. I could very easily trace on the diagram all the different pieces and people and places that software had to go to get from ideation to delivery. That's the kind of thing that you're going to want to make. So don't skimp on the details. So for instance, we're starting at the beginning, right? So a request is coming in. Who made that request? How did it get here? Right? How did it end up on your desk? How did it get prioritized? Did it get prioritized by anything? Is that's your job? What are all the things that happened prior to the request having active work done on it, right? And that's going to vary from organization to organization. Some organizations have a lot of stuff that happens. This group refines it, then this group refines it, then this person refines it, and then this person breaks it into user stories or whatever. There's this prioritization meeting, there's this roadmap planet. Whatever goes into that upfront stuff, capture it. Okay, what has to happen before that thing gets on your desk? And then once it's sort of within your boundaries, right, now your teams have the thing and it is time to actively work on fulfilling that request, whatever it is, a user story, a maintenance ticket, whatever it is that your department is going to deliver in response to that request. What happens then? Okay, do things happen before coders start writing code, for example? Is there a requirements gathering process? Or did that happen a long time ago, right? Does it happen when that item comes across your desk? Is there a design team that does a lot of mock-ups, right? Or a little bit of a mock-up before anybody starts typing? What is all the work, again, that is happening around this item before coding starts, right? And capture all of those things. When do the coders actually start coding in the process? And how do they decide that it is time to code that thing? What happens? Do you assign it to them? Does somebody else assign it to them? Do they come to you and say, boss, I got done with everything. I need more work. Could you give it to me? Do they use a board? How does all that happen? And then you have coders coding, right? And they write code. And that's the part of the process that most of us are the most familiar with when we're thinking of software development teams, right? Coders gone code. And they do that. And then what happens after that? Do they have some kind of testing thing that they do? Is there another team that does the testing? And what does that dynamic look like? What happens if they find something wrong, if that's the case? Does your pipeline do the testing? How do they handle that in your organization? And then, whatever post-coding activities occur, which could be user acceptance, it could be this committee has to be okay with it. It could be this senior developer has to approve the PR. Again, we're trying to capture everything that has to happen to move this thing along, right? And then once all that stuff happens, then where does it go? Does it migrate through different environments? Do different things happen at those environments? Or is it all just an automated pipeline that moves it to this server, runs a bunch of tests, all that's green, so it moves to the next server? Or do you have people looking at these environments? Are they doing like manual testing? Are you demoing off of these things? Does that have to happen right before this thing gets delivered? What are all the things that have to happen leading right up to production? And then what happens to get it into production? Does the thing sit for a while and then you have a release once a month or something like that? Does it get put into production the instant that it passes through all the other things? As soon as it's ready, just drop straight into production. What is the process of getting something from that final stage into that production server? And then are there any activities that happen after that in order for that thing to be counted as delivered? Do you have to wait until a certain amount of functionality has been built out before you can say this thing was delivered, people can get value from this thing? So you want to create a visualization, even if it's just a line with labels. I think it's kind of cool to like make little sketches, if a committee has to approve it, draw little people and arrows and things like that. Depending on how you're bent, you might make yours a little more artistic than others. But whatever you do, it needs to communicate and it needs to make clear all the different points along the way that somebody has to do something or that it's waiting for somebody to do something. And that's the other thing, right? When you're putting this timeline together, it's not just about the things people are doing. It's also about when is this waiting for the next thing to pick it up? So is it waiting on a person? Does a senior dev have to approve a PR request, for example? Is there somebody who has to push the button to move it to staging when it's ready for staging? What are the times that the thing is waiting on a person to do something? What are the times that it's waiting for a specific time period? If you're doing Scrum, do you only move things into production at the end of the sprint? So if I got something done the third day of the sprint, it's just going to hang out for a while, right? It's not going to make it into production until a specific period of time elapses. Or maybe your organization does cadenced releases to production, once a week, once a month, once a quarter, once a year, I don't know what it is, but note that on the map, right? That this has to wait a certain period of time. Or what if what if this thing is being handed off, right? So another team has to get around to it. So this happens a lot, especially in larger organizations where instead of the teams being cross-functional, teams are formed around specialization, right? So you have like the UI UX team, and then you have the .NET programmers, and then maybe you have the infrastructure team, and then you got the DBAs, and you've got quality engineering over here. And the item has to get passed around through all these different teams in order for it to end up in production. So put that on your line, put that on your diagram when things have to be handed off, use a little symbol for it or something like that. Because what you want is you want to be able to look at this thing and see quite clearly where the weak points are. And anytime that item changes hands is a potential time for misunderstanding and delay, right? If you think about waterfall, right, and you think of like the distinct phase gates that most organizations did when they were doing waterfall, you think of, you do all the requirements, right? And then you do all the design, and then you do all the code, and then you do all the test, and then you do the deployment? Well, a lot of times in organizations, even if they are agile and they don't do big batch projects that way, they still divide teams and responsibilities up that way. And those can be potentially weak points in the process where team A is done with something, team B doesn't have the capacity to pick it up yet, but they need to in order to move it forward. So there's a little bit of dead time, right, where that item just kind of sits waiting for team B's capacity to open up. Put that on your diagram, put that on your map. This is probably going to take a little bit, and depending on your artistic talents, it might be a little challenging, but it's going to be worth it. It's going to be worth it for a number of reasons. You are getting a lot out of this exercise. First of all, if you remember our last episode, and if you don't, go listen to it. It's great. And the guy who is speaking on that episode, genius, sheer genius. So check it out. But in that episode, we talked about the need to ask questions to discern the lay of the land prior to making recommendations. This is a great way to get those conversations going because, it's one thing to walk up to a developer and say, oh, you're coding right now. Okay, well, what are you going to do after that? It's another thing to come to your developers and say, hey, I'm trying to put together a visualization of our process from start to finish. So I'm going around talking to everybody. Where are you guys in this process? Okay, what happens right before? What happens after? What happens while you've got your hands on it? I'm just trying to get this information so I can make this visualization. Well, that's a very non-threatening thing then, You're not asking them because you are quote unquote curious about what they're doing. You're asking them because you're making a thing. You're making a visualization. So it provides a non-threatening forum to kind of get that information that you want to get before you start making recommendations. And I have found personally that even the act of asking a person or a group of people, how do you do this thing, or what happens before you, or what happens after you, tell me about your role in all of this, that just the act of asking that and people starting to talk through that, things start to happen almost on their own, right? To a certain extent. Somebody will start talking through their process and it will occur to them like, oh, this is part of our process that's not very good, or it's very slow, or it's very inefficient. And they may just pony that information up, right? They just might tell you right off the bat, like, yeah, now that I think about it, this actually causes a big delay when we're trying to get things out the door. Yeah, make a note of that, right? But people will begin thinking critically, more analytically about processes that they've just done by rote for months and months, perhaps even years and years, right? And so they'll kind of see it with new eyes for the first time, and you'll get some good feedback from that. Another thing that you can do is, as you are looking at your map here, especially as you're noting things like handoffs, points of delay, dependencies that one team may have on another team, times when things are waiting for a person or a committee to check a checklist, right? Or to be okay with what's going through. As you're looking at this map, you will begin to see things that I call kinks in the garden hose. When I was a kid, I used to love to do that. Like if mom and dad were out, watering the grass or something like that, you'd go up, close to where the spigot was, and you would take the garden hose and you would bend it, and it would stop the water flow or drastically slow it down at the other end, and then mom or dad are kind of like messing with it a little bit, and then you let go. Right? And then the kink comes out. All that water that had been waiting to burst out comes shooting out of the hose, comes rocketing out. Bonus points if they happen to be looking in the hose when this happened. But those things happen in any system where things are flowing. Things that are in the hose that get kinked up, that slow the flow down or hold it back. That if you could unkink those things, you might end up picking up quite a bit of flow, quite a bit of delivery capacity that you didn't have before, absolutely free, without hiring a single person, right? Or buying another single piece of equipment. And this map will help you see potential areas that you might direct your attention to later. I've also found that more people than me get interested in this diagram, okay? Because very rarely has someone taken the time to map out the whole process in a clearly visible way that everyone can see. Well, now you've got something that lots of people can look at, right? Now you've got something that you can take to department head meetings, right? Now you've got something that you can show developer teams or show your ops folks or whatever and be like, look, I mean, have you guys noticed this? Did any of you know this thing was happening over here? And it's an information radiator at that point. And a lot of other layers of management will probably get pretty interested once you've created that thing. And that will give you the impetus you need to start making helpful changes. But the last thing, and this is kind of my own personal interest in it, is you're gathering the raw materials to start putting Kanban boards together. Spoiler alert, I'm going to recommend that bare minimum you think really seriously about bringing Kanban to your operation in some form or fashion. And I don't mean Kanban as in like an alternative development methodology, like people talk about Scrum versus Kanban and things like that. That's not what I mean. I mean Kanban as a workflow analysis and control strategy, right? No matter what you're doing, it can be modeled that way. And so this thing that you made where you noted every little detail, you're going to create abstractions off of that are going to map out those pieces of the process with not as much detail in them, but now you sort of have an idea of the things that have to happen in order to transform that request into a deliverable. And if you have that process mapped out, then you can make a board or something out of it. You can start putting your work items where they are in that process. And now you can start measuring flow. You can see where your backlogs really are, some part of the chain that doesn't have the same capacity as something upstream and things start piling up. Now, all of a sudden, you have laid the foundation for tools that will really help you as you begin to analyze your teams, your departments, and give you good suggestions. So I hope this is a helpful suggestion. I have always found this exercise to be very valuable, especially if I'm coming into a place that I'm new to, right, and have never been before. It's a really good way to get the information that I need so that I can look at it in a very readable, accessible way, and then begin to look for those points where I might want to focus my attention where we can get improvements to flow. Thanks, everyone, for listening to Agile Bites. Agile does sometimes bite, but we don't think it always has to. If you enjoyed what you heard today, don't forget to like and subscribe to this podcast on whatever platform you happen to be using. And if you can, leave us a comment because we'd love to hear your feedback. What things would you like to hear about? What things did you hear that were valuable to you today? You can also head over to integrityinspired.com to sign up to our email list. But that's all for today, folks. We'll see you next time.